So, this week we're going to talk about how language develops through the story. And through the story, the child emerges as a fluent user of language, and they start to emerge into developing their whole new language, which is written language. And it's through the story that often this first emerges. So some of the vocabulary for this week includes pragmatics, relevance, displacement, shading, and narrative. So in previous weeks, we talked about the largest area of growth being in the area of pragmatics. Secondary to that, another great area of growth is in the area of semantics. And while the kindergartner comes to school with the basics of language in place, they have vocabulary, they understand that language is used for a variety of purposes, they are not yet a good conversationalist. So they don't really have that turn taking in conversation mastered. They don't know how to enter and end conversations well, not as their adolescent and adult counterparts might. What do kindergartners look like? And like I said, while they're talking in these complex sentences and they have quite extensive vocabularies, they understand some basic rules of grammar and syntax. They also, in a story, assume shared knowledge. What that means is they might start in the middle of a story. They might use pronouns that are he, she. He said to her that he couldn't go because she didn't want to. And we, as the listener, have no idea who he and she are referring to. So that's very typical in a very young storyteller's pattern, that they have this assumption that their perspective is also their listener's perspective. They have not yet used the art or learned to use the art of swaying a listener to their perspective or manipulating their listener. They're just beginning to grasp indirect messages. So if someone says, "Ooh, that ice cream sure looks good," they understand that that person wants a bite of the ice cream, but they may not quite know how to use that indirect language in conversation. They aren't quite adept at using emotion to entertain in a story or to provide interest in a story. The art of the storytell emerges as the child's language continues to grow. So another characteristic of the very young child, typically in kindergarten, first, second, so you think about that 5 through 7-year-old, they flit from one topic to another. So they may be talking about recess in one breath, and they may be talking about their grandma's chocolate chip cookies in the very next breath. They don't really look for or create connection from one sentence to another or from one conversation to another. They aren't quite sure what to do when someone interjects. If there's an ongoing conversation and someone interjects with another comment, while they might be pretty good with the two-person back and forth, that third person, that triad, offers for them a little bit of complexity that is kind of tough for them to manage. Children, again, taking perspective from their own side versus taking the perspective of the listener is very difficult for them. And so relevance, being able to understand the relevance of their topic to the listener, relevance of their topic to the topic at hand, is very difficult for the young child. What is relevance? Just to make sure that we're talking about the same idea, we're talking about how things relate to each other. So if I say, how was your vacation? You might say, oh, it was great. And then you might reply back to me, how was Hawaii? Because you know that we're now talking about vacations. You're aware that I went to Hawaii. And so now you're going to bring your question into relevant comment in the conversation. A young child, a kindergarten, first, second, even a third grader, I might say, how was your vacation? And their response would be, oh, it was fine. I don't think my mom gave me chocolate chip cookies today. So the relevance of their next comment is not only not connected to their listener, as a partner, but also is only taken from their own egocentric perspective of what's relevant to them. As the child moves into the middle school years or those junior high years, somewhere between fifth grade, sixth grade, and on and through adolescence, they look for relevance. They look to be relevant in the conversation. They try and add more relevant comments to an ongoing conversation, and they interject more appropriately. In fact, at this time, when we see children who have pragmatic language deficits, it's here we start to notice that the alienation within their peer group might occur, because a second and third grader accepts the irrelevant comment from a peer, whereas the fifth and sixth grader does not accept the irrelevant comment from a peer. And so those children who have deficits or difficulty with social pragmatic skills and conversational turn taking have difficulty with relevance and being able to be relevant to the perspective of their listener. And we start to see them sticking out a little bit more at this age level. When we talk about relevance, we also talk about shading, how a child goes from talking about something that's immediately important, what they want to talk about, versus what you as the listener are interested in. They have to move gently between the boundary of what their interest is and what they really want to say and what is relevant or interesting to their listener group. Now, we all know adults that are not good with this, who take no consideration of shading. They don't move from their own personal egocentric topic into that of relevance to the group. Because this is a skill that is learned over time, and not everyone learns it well. How does it emerge? Well, we know in the preschool child, they talk about concrete things, things that they can see, touch, and hear. Whereas the middle school child, that fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh, eighth, they are able to now talk about abstract topics. They're able to create conversations that involve not only others' perspective, but maybe even things that are imaginary or can involve you in a story that is hypothetical. A preschooler is going to hold on to their topic. They're going to try and hold the floor, and the way they do that, the way they try and keep the conversation going, rather than creating a new relevant comment, they're actually going to repeat what their partner says. So if two children are playing and one child says, "Oh, the blocks fell down," the other preschooler might say, "My car crashed." The preschooler who started the conversation will say, "Your car crashed," or "The car crashed." They're going to repeat what their partner says in order to help move the conversation into an exchange. The 6 to 8-year-old is going to add new information. So create that same scenario, two children playing. One child might say something like, "Oh, the blocks fell down." The other child says, "Oh, my car crashed into them." The child who started the conversation will say, "Try and go around the outside." So they're going to add information to the ongoing conversation in order to move it into an exchange. The 10 to 12-year-old is going to move the conversation, but also still keep perspective of what they want to talk about. And so they become more artful in keeping the conversation going on topics that are interesting to both themselves and to their listener. One of the factors of language that impacts a child's ability to be a good storyteller, to tell and understand how to relate information, is the concept of displacement. It's a feature of language that we know to be true. We know that displacement is the ability to talk about things that are distant in time and space. So it allows you and I to talk about Hawaii. It allows you and I to talk about the Civil War. It allows you and I to talk about the landing of the astronauts on the moon. We can talk about things that are away from our immediate experiences. Displacement, the ability to use displacement, doesn't actually emerge in young children until about 5 or 6 years of age, which is why one of the reasons the preschooler really struggles with the story retell. You will often hear little preschoolers and kindergartners talk about, well, I went to grandma's house yesterday, or I'm going to Disneyland tomorrow. What they actually mean is anything that's not happening right now. Yesterday can actually be yesterday or can be any time in the past, just as tomorrow is anything that's not happening today, but is happening sometime in the future. They don't really have a good grasp of that sense of time and space. If you ask them, well, where does grandma live? She lives very far away. It took us a long time to get there, and you find out she lived in Tempe. Um, or you'll ask the child, where does grandma live? They say, I don't know. You say, was it close or far? Did you go, was it far away? Oh, no, it's not far away. And you find out that grandma and grandpa live in Alaska. So they just don't have that grasp of distance or time into their repertoire quite yet. But it does start to emerge in kindergarten and first grade. Preschoolers and kinders talk about the here and now. They talk about their current experiences, the things that they have personally gone through. Does this tie, as you're thinking about it, to why we say that trips outside the home and the role of the caregiver are so important in the developing preschooler, right? Because it is the child's experiences that they are able to talk about. So if a child has limited experiences, their conversational language is also limited. When a child goes to school, their experiences expand because the teacher now presents opportunities for discussions and more experiences that allows them to engage with ideas about people, places, and things that are outside of what they've personally experienced. They start to talk to friends, they start to hear from their classroom teacher, they start to look in books that all reference things that are not personal to them. And this helps engage their ability to use displacement to then develop their ability to tell a story. Storytelling in the young language learner often has or approaches us in this giant heap. It comes at us with a whole bunch of information and might sound something like, I went to grandma's house and we went swimming and we made cookies and they're chocolate chip cookies and I like chocolate chip cookies and my grandma makes the best chocolate chip cookies and I got a boo-boo on my foot and I have a Band-Aid. And then we went home. And they have really no problem in their story. They have no essential characters. There's rarely any dialogue. There isn't really a defined sequence. So these are the pieces to the essential storytelling that are missing in the very young kindergartner. As a child develops into, say, second grade, they've now experienced more storytelling through the school environment. They're more exposed to literature, even if they've come from homes where literature isn't emphasized. They still have had that experience of now seeing it in the school setting. And so they have an idea that stories must have a sequence. We look for their idea to develop. They must have a first, next, then finally sort of concept by the end of first grade. That's an expected, typically developing outcome, that they really understand that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end to stories. And by second grade, their stories now have a plot. And there's often a cause and effect relationship within the story, and it often has a conclusion. By third, fourth grade, that's where we really see the true narrative emerge. And now we're going to hear characters. We're going to hear dialogue. Well, Susie said to Ben, we better not go in there, because the child now has experienced that type of dialogue through literature that we've exposed them to. And now they're able to echo that in their own storytelling and start to put it into their written language skills too. It is not until the end of third grade that we really see a true, full narrative. Let's take a look at this young boy telling a story. So that little boy has the idea of embedding narrative, right? He has the idea of embedding dialogue. He's trying to memorize it from a story that he's already heard, and he's learned how to use emotion to engage his audience. So while I don't know his age, I could guess he's probably between second and third grade, and that he's heard a narrative, he's trying to repeat the narrative, he's learned to embed sequence. He had that first and then second and then third. It was important for him to make sure that he had all of the right pieces there. And he starts to understand that there's a meaning to the sequence, and that it's important for stories to have a sequence, otherwise they will lose something in translation. So the impact on the 7 and 8-year-old is from the curriculum. They have read storybooks. They have all of their books up to this point have lots of pictures, and those pictures are attached to the text. The pictures help children create a visual image of how that story unfolds. As children emerge into the third grade, those pictures tend to become less and less. And now the text is the majority of where the information comes from. And so children now have to create that imagery for themselves to create the story sequence, the image of the character. What does Hansel and what does Hansel and Gretel look like? What does Harry Potter look like? They have created that image in their own mind by reading the text. And time spent with stories is what facilitates the child's ability to visualize, and in their ability to visualize helps them become better storytellers themselves. We find that children who lack the ability to visualize imagery from text also tend to not be good storytellers. As the child emerges into the adolescent years, they actually find storytelling as a way of creating their own identity. They create their own identity by the stories of their social group. So they tend to do events together, and they associate importance, value, self-image, how exciting or valuable their life is based off of their social group experiences. They bond with people based off of shared event history and shared experiences, which is why, say, in the culture of a junior high or a high school, that they have this camaraderie or this bonding within groups of just being in the general high school environment. So everyone who goes to, say, Parker High School, they all are connected by being a member of Parker High School, but within that larger group, there are subsets of people with specific interests, let's say band, that people who are in the band are bonded together by the experiences, the stories that they have developed through their shared experiences as being a part of that social group. And so the teenager finds their identity via their social narrative. And we see that, right? We see that in things like Snapchat and Instagram, where their social identity is a part of our very rich and growing social network worldwide. So, as a child hits the end of their school days, we've now seen how and why their language has grown so immensely. They have developed this intricate pattern of understanding of social pragmatics. Their vocabulary has become expansive depending on the nature of the topics they have covered and studied. They have thoughts and ideas, feelings of their own. They can manipulate and use language for its variety of purposes. They know how to alter their words, their syntax, their tone, their loudness in order to alter meaning. And they have become, we hope, good storytellers because it is the essence of the story that really builds our lives. Everything we do is a story, whether you went to lunch with someone, you went to the movies, you sat at home, you went to work. Pretty much everything we do in life encompasses a type of story. But now that the story it has developed and all these other pieces have come together, we have to kind of take a look at this other piece of language that became embedded in the young learner along the way, and that's reading and writing. So while they've been developing and working on this social language, simultaneously they have learned that the written word also is a means of them expressing their ideas, sharing information, and learning syntax, vocabulary, social rules, and experiences about other places. And so that's what we're going to explore next is the reading and writing development of the child. Have a great week, and I will see you next week.